Nope.
All right. So my question is, how can we align state policy to maximize the value of the National Guard's capability and services? And are state entities making a good use of your services currently?
I think yes to both questions. I think number one, the governor's executive order, and then number two, AB 670. I think those two actions really developed a pathway for the military department to deploy our computer network defense team capability, which allows us to do a variety of different levels of assessments in state agency and quasi-state agency networks. So I think both the governor's executive order and your bill, ma'am, AB 670, gives us a very adequate pathway, a good first step to step off and really determine and learn, what the vulnerabilities are across our state government networks.
And how many assessments did you perform last year?
Last year we did 13, I believe.
And then what are you looking at?
And this year we've done 9.
So what did you find last year? What are you seeing this year?
Sure. Generally, what we find are a basic lack of network hygiene. So we're talking about misdirected firewalls, out-of-the-box configurations that allow no firewalls to be achieved, some malware, but just general poor network hygiene, and I think that's across the board. Larger the entities that we look at, the more vulnerabilities that we find. But on the upside, when we've had the opportunity to go back and reassess an agency, we've seen at times more than a 10-fold reduction in the vulnerabilities. So the assessments work, and agencies that take advantage of those assessments are dramatically improving the ability of their networks to maintain the integrity of their data.
Do you have a role beyond state government in cybersecurity?
We do. Really on 2 lines of effort. First line would be our federal mission. So we have a fairly robust cybersecurity enterprise, both in the Army and the Air National Guard, under Title 32 if we're under state command and control, and Title 10 and Title 50 if we're working under the federal government's control. So we work on a variety of those things, fighting and winning the nation's cyber wars, if you will. So we also have the computer network defense team capability that's inherently a state function, and we employ that as well. But probably the last and more important piece is that we work very closely with, again, agencies, quasi-agencies, but more importantly, folks that maintain the state's critical infrastructure in the private sector. We've been very successful in reaching out to those organizations and helping them both from an information sharing aspect as well as tabletop exercises and full-scale exercises to walk them through how the state would employ the state's resources in the event of some kind of catastrophic cyber event. And I think it's also important to mention now that we don't do any of this in a vacuum. The military department is fundamentally a supporting agency in all of these things. We take our taskings through the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. They're the tasking authority for the department, and oftentimes when we're doing these assessments, we're working with the private sector, especially in critical infrastructure. We're working for or with the Department of Technology as the supported agency.
All right. Thank you. What? Oh, okay. We'll talk a little bit more about critical infrastructure. Can you, that is what you're tasked with is protecting, or one of the things you're tasked with, protecting critical infrastructure. What are the exercises and training that are being done today in that regard?
Sure. I don't want to talk specifically to the private sector partners that we're working with. I think that might be inappropriate. We could do that offline or in a closed session. I think that would be appropriate. But we recently completed, to give you some anecdotal discussion points, with a large private or public utility, essentially do what they call a black start or cold start exercise. So the entire network comes down. How does that get restarted? How does the state help? How does the military department help? How do we do that? So it was a big tabletop exercise. All the players, key players from across the state, so state government, federal government, local government, the public utility, all were able to sit there and kind of walk through that scenario. And I thought it was hugely beneficial for everybody that participated in the event.
All right, and then my final question is, how can the state support more of that type of activity?
I think what we're doing right now is adequate in that regard. I don't think from a legislative standpoint, I don't think we need to do any more there. I really believe across the entire cyber enterprise that the governor's executive order and AB 670, I think, are the absolute right the right recipe to deliver value to the state today. And I think going forward, we should take a look at how the governor's executive order plays out, the Cyber Integration Center, how that works, and how we look after we conclude the assessments that are mandated under your bill, and then take a look at that going forward. And I think we'll be in a good place.
All right, thank you. Chair Chow, do you have any questions?
I do not have any questions. Thank you.
Oh, all right. Thank you so much, and for being patient, too.
Yes, ma'am.
We are running a little bit late, but we really appreciate you coming today. All right, and then for our last state official, we have the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Director Ghilarducci. And as you see, we're running over time, so hopefully you can make your comments short and leave a little time for questioning. And I do apologize that it took us 2 hours and 5 minutes to get to this point. But
No
thank you
worries,
very
no
much
worries.
for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair. So, in the interest of brevity, maybe I can just say that without a big opening statement, that you've heard a lot about where we are at with the cybersecurity posture for California at this point. It's important to understand that the threat that we face continues to evolve. There is no silver bullet to this. It's not a linear pathway to be able to address. Basically, you see a threat. You put a mitigation factor in place and you're good to go. This is an ever-changing and ever-evolving threat, and we and the Homeland Security Agency, have identified cyber as one of the top 5 threats to California. You also heard that a lot of what can be done falls under the area of cyber hygiene, better cyber hygiene. This is very, very important, not just for state agencies and employees of the state, but generally all of us in the public, in having a better understanding of the threat and a better understanding of how to operate within the cyber world. In fact, I just saw a statistic a couple of days ago that indicated that a lot of what happens to individuals can be mitigated up to 85% by doing better cyber hygiene. And I think that this is really something to consider in public education, in educating our school children. As I think I mentioned, my wife's a second grade school teacher, and all but one of her children have iPhones. And it's something to understand as we change in this culture and become a culture of the Internet of Things. It's very, very critical that we move forward with better education and information sharing. So with that, I just want to say it's a broad threat, but I'd be happy to answer specific questions that you may have, just to be rapid on where we're at with moving forward with the various initiatives.
Okay, so walk me through a cyber threat where the state would be involved. Where do the resources come from? And we still haven't heard, we asked this before, who would be in charge?
Right. So again, you have to consider, there's no straight answer to that, because if it's a state agency specifically that has had a cyber intrusion of some sort, per protocol, the agency is designated to notify the Highway Patrol, and the Highway Patrol works and then immediately with the Office of Information Security to be able to identify 2 things. One is, has a crime been committed? And 2 is, what was the extent of the breach, the type of breach, and what is the impact? So in that process, in that analysis, if it's a crime that's been committed, the CHP takes the lead with regards to doing the investigative process. For them to be fully successful, there's a multitude of other kinds of resources that would support that initiative. Certainly, the Information Security Office would be supporting through information about the network that's been intruded. The Office of Emergency Services would support through our intelligence network in being able to provide whatever information through our fusion centers, our threat assessment centers, to provide intelligence to support the CHP's criminal investigation. If there's no criminal predicate to this, then really it's the Information Security Office takes the lead to identify what is the impact of the intrusion and what do we need to do working with those department that has been impacted to mitigate the situation. Again, they would coordinate that information with us and with the State Threat Assessment Center so that we can provide them any kind of additional information. Is it a state actor? Is it a foreign actor? Where did the intrusion come from? These are the kinds of support we would provide. But the two primary agencies currently that would take that lead in a state intrusion would be the CHP and the Information Security Office.
All right. Chair Chow, do you have some questions?
Sure.
And then I'll ask some more after you're done.
Oh, okay, thank you. Would it be correct to say that you are the person in charge of cybersecurity for California?
I don't think that's an accurate statement. I'm in charge of Homeland Security for California. Under the Homeland Security rubric, cyber certainly is a threat that falls under my my purview. That said, as I just mentioned, there are some specific departments with statutory authority that are day-to-day working the cyber event. My concern is from a statewide holistic approach. What are we looking at? What are the security threats to California? There are many, quite frankly. Cyber is one that continues to evolve, and that is one of the reasons why we, in 2013, put in place the Cybersecurity Task Force to start to take this evolving threat and make it into something that we were more informed with, and we also understood that because it's not a linear approach, we would need to engage the private sector, which in our view, in our case, actually owns much of the private infrastructure in California, critical infrastructure in California. And so we needed to bring them in a collaborative way to be able to address the issue. From that, then, of course, came the governor's executive order to move forward with the Cybersecurity Integration Center. These initiatives were to take all of the work that the individual departments have been doing for years and now look at this threat and bring all of these agencies together in a more coordinated fashion to address the holistic threats and holistic security for California.
So if it's not you, then would it be correct to say that there's no one single person or point department as far as cybersecurity is concerned for California? There's no one person, no one department that's responsible for it.
Well, from a Homeland Security perspective, statewide security, as I mentioned, OES would have that responsibility to ensure the security, and that's why we've been leading these various initiatives. From the state perspective of actually responding to a state intrusion, the departments I mentioned have that lead.
In your view, how secure is California when it comes to cybersecurity or against cybersecurity attack?
Well, from my view, we are not as secure as we need to be. I mean, we all understand that a lot of our systems at the state are legacy systems, they're older systems. But even if we were to invest many millions of dollars and to bring everything up to immediate security standards, the actors that are involved in cybersecurity attacks are always working one step ahead. So someone said earlier, this is this is never an ending process. We need to continually work together to stay out in front of this threat. The threat will continue to get more complex. But one area that we need to look in is working with people who are developing things like apps and software and other kind of computer networks to ensure that they're building in the strongest security capabilities and not just providing to governments or individuals, public, products that can be continually intruded by cyber attacks. So this is the idea behind the cybersecurity task force, is that as these capabilities continue to be developed, are we building in the most robust standards to protect our communities?
How much of California's budget is devoted or allocated for cybersecurity issues as a percentage of the budget, if you know?
I don't know statewide the amount of budget that's been allocated for cyber. Each department has their own determination of how much they're investing in the cyber. We at OES invest several $1 million for the agency, but we also have the mission of Homeland Security, and we are using Homeland Security funding as a primary source to be able to address both the Cybersecurity Task Force and the build-out of the Cybersecurity Integration Center. That in itself falls under several $1 million.
How does California compare to other states when it comes to cybersecurity or cyber safety?
Yeah, it's a great question. I work very closely on the governor's Homeland Security Advisory Council. It's all my counterparts throughout the nation. This is not a unique problem to California. I will tell you, though, that many of the actions that we have put in place, both your actions here in the legislature, some member Irwin's bill, and what we've done with the Cyber Security Task Force and Integration Center, are unique in the country. Other states are starting to model after what California is doing from this standpoint of taking a holistic review of the threat for their states. And in fact, we have really engaged very closely and successfully with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the FBI in getting them to want to invest into what we're doing here in California. So other states have the same problem. Many of them are not where we are currently at, but there are a couple that I would say New York and Michigan have done quite a bit and probably are about the same level that we're at.
Thank you.
I have a couple of additional questions. The governor's executive order calls for a state cybersecurity strategy. Who is in charge of that process? Where are we in that process? And how many people at OES are full-time dedicated to developing that strategy and then dedicated to the Integration Center?
Great question. So we have an overarching state Homeland Security strategy. There's a component in that that addresses cyber. Because the threat continues to evolve and we're learning more, we learn more from last year than to this year about the kind of threat that we're seeing. The team of that we have in critical infrastructure protection, our state threat assessment center, they're currently and actively working on developing the build out of the specific cybersecurity strategy, the component of the overarching state strategy. Understand that there are many components to that. Part of it is you mentioned with Department of Technology, EF-18 on a broader scale, that plugs into that. The work we're doing with the Integration Center plugs into that. Information sharing, building out issues of public education response capabilities that we're building in the Cybersecurity Task Force all feed into that. That's constantly, currently under development as far as making sure that all of those by the minute informations are incorporated. Between the State Threat Assessment Center, our critical infrastructure protection team, and within our division of law enforcement, we have something like, I think, around 18 or 19 that are working on cybersecurity issues each and every day.
Okay, but do we have a timeline on? I understand you say the strategy is evolving, but a timeline when we sort of say, well, this is the product right now.
I'm hoping that. One part of what we call the concept of operations under the Cybersecurity Integration Center will be done within about 2.5 weeks. But let me just be clear. events happen while you're planning. Disasters happen while you're planning. Planning is important, but the fact is that we are operating under that strategy currently. So the cybersecurity strategy, from my office's perspective, we are working that each and every day. An actual physical document, because of this EO and the many changes that have occurred, results from your legislation, the assessments that are being done, all of that's being incorporated. And to tell you when the document, an actual physical document, will be done, I couldn't tell you right this moment, but I could tell you it is on. That information is being worked each and every day.
Okay, and then, we were really excited about the executive order, but I don't see any mention of it in the state budget. So how can we move forward with the executive order without resources?
Well, we are doing that 100% with existing resources. These are Homeland Security grant dollars that we have as the state's Homeland Security agency. We felt that the fastest, most expedient way to be able to get the integration center up, operational, in place, and moving forward was to use existing grant dollars that we had for the security position for California. So that's what we're leveraging at this point.
Okay, and they have the proper training to be able to do this?
The individuals?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the individuals under the integration center, this center will be made up of analysts that are specializing in that cyber world. We call them kind of cyber warriors. They are specialists, but they'll also be made up of members of the Highway Patrol, of the California National Guard, the same members that you had representations here earlier presenting. Those entities will all come under this umbrella and will operate under a common operating concept, which will then, again, it's not replacing their statutory authority. They are still doing their statutory authorities, but it's rolling up into a much more coordinated and collaborative session. So you're already getting people who are trained and operational. We're now just repurposing them in a much more coordinated way.
So the executive order can be carried out with no additional budget?
At this time, that's correct.
Oh, that's, I guess, always good news, right?
Well, we're trying to leverage the funding that we have and that are made available. We have also asked one thing we were able to gain approval from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to utilize existing grant funds that we had for this purpose. That was a major step forward. And recently there was, in the president's budget, there was a request for a significant amount of money at the federal level for cybersecurity. And I'm working with all my counterparts from the other states to establish a procedure and a request that a large chunk of that money come to states for the sustainability and long-term viability of our cybersecurity initiatives. So, it's a perfect, in my view, as a state Homeland Security advisor, it's a perfect venue, it's a perfect project to use Homeland Security funds for, because it does represent security for the state of California.
All right. Do you have some more?
Just a quick follow-up on the idea of information sharing. What mechanism would you suggest that we should use going forward to share information between, let's say, your department and the legislature?
That's a great question. And one of the things that we're working on, Senator, is on a monthly basis, we're going to be setting up it's a non-classified briefing that we're going to be able to provide the legislature. We're going to be setting that up starting hopefully next month, and we'll pick a day, and either members or their staff can come, and we're going to brief out on a number of things associated with security threats to the state. A piece of that will be cyber, but I think from my view, it's important for you all to know what are we seeing in a changing threat picture for California, and it gives you kind of real time in front information that you can be aware of, and so that you're not hearing something in the news or something down the road. So we're going to be starting that. The plan is to start that next month, and it'll be every month.
Are we going to be privy to the classified component of the scheme also, or is that not possible at all whatsoever?
It's not at this time. It's something that, I mean, if there is a specific threat that we need to get you read into, the classification process is as you can understand, a very extensive process, and it's governed by federal law, so we have to be very careful with that. But if there are some specific needs that we can work with the FBI to get you read into on a case-by-case basis, we will try to do that.
Okay. Just FYI, I did have clearance from my IBM days too.
Okay. All right. It's good to know. The TS? Okay, good. We can maybe re-energize that.
FYI, so did I.
But they couldn't tell each other technically because they were.
Oh, yeah, actually, you're not supposed to, so
Yes,
we
right.
probably shouldn't have. So, oops. Hopefully this wasn't being filmed. So then, I keep saying this is my last question, but really this will be my last question. How can we better integrate the legislature into the state's cybersecurity conversation, kind of feeding off of what Mr. Chow said?
Well, I think a couple ways. One is these hearings are always very good to be able to address concerns and issues. I think this monthly briefing format will be something where we can, it will not only provide answers and information, but it will also maybe stimulate some additional questions and discussions. We readily look for members of your staff to participate in the state cybersecurity task force. It's a very dynamic group, and they're making a lot of headway with recommendations. And certainly any briefings that we can provide you or any member as individuals, we can come to you or over to OES on a regular basis. We'd be happy to do that.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Guladucci.
Okay, guys. Thanks.
Well, I certainly appreciate everybody being here today. We did go through and look at some potential action items, and there's a whole list of them. I'll just I think potentially look at the creation of a cyber czar, somebody who's full-time in charge of cybersecurity. We need to find better ways and more creative ways of improving hiring and the retention of cybersecurity staff. We heard about the lack of resources, and I think that's really having the appropriately trained people within state governments. And I think we also need to establish a more formal structure for passing detailed information between the executive branch and the legislature, or maybe just specific members of the legislature. And we need to look at requiring the task force to begin operating with specific tasks and timelines for completion. And then, I think, again, the big thing we were looking at today was the state auditor's report, and there definitely needs to be follow-up on that because, as I said before, very disturbing information. So what I would say is a request BSA compliance assessment of all remaining unsurveyed state agencies and constitutional offices, and the 20 that refused or ignored the request for an audit the first time, and set an August hearing to review BSA's one-year follow-up report for the 2015 audit. So those are just some of the things that I think that we definitely need to look at. I don't know if Chair Chow, do you have anything to add to that?
That's a pretty comprehensive list. So I want to thank all the presenters for joining us today, and also thank you, Madam Chair, for organizing this event, and also staff. So thank you for coming.